I would like to welcome everyone today, especially the speakers, but also all our participants to our first event today on the topic, which is a series called USA Back to Multilateralism, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons enters into force. Before we start the discussion, I would very, very shortly like to hand the floor over to HEINZ GÄRTNER, who is the chair of our advisory board, who has been initialing this series, and he will very, very briefly just give an overview about our planned activities in this context, and then I will take over again and will moderate the session. So HEINZ, the floor is yours. Please go along.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. Also welcome from my side. Of course, we organize, the International Institute for Peace organizes this event on the occasion of the entry of the force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As Stephanie already mentioned, it's part of our series, the United States, back to multilateralism. I also want to thank all the panelists now for participating in this very timely event because the treaty, as the so-called PEN treaty, will enter into force in 2 days. It's a remarkable event. It's a success. The success was already last year when all the ratifications already came in for the treaty to enter into force. More ratifications will come in the future. Why is it remarkable? It's important because the treaty makes it illegal for state parties to acquire, possess, use, threaten to use nuclear weapons. So it calls for the elimination of all nuclear weapons. But I think it even more important would be that the treaty provides an alternative norm to the norm of deterrence, nuclear deterrence, which prevails within the nuclear weapon states. And its logic is that nuclear weapon states have to prepare eventually for nuclear war, what the treaty wants to prevent. The treaty is supported by a large number of non-nuclear weapon states, but opposed by all nuclear weapon states and its allies. Unfortunately, Europe, statistically, Europe is the continent where we have the lowest percentage of countries who joined the NPT. We will discuss this during the event, but probably it's also NATO, which strongly opposes the treaty and calls it for basically for illegal. The treaty also calls for the full implementation of Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which calls for the complete disarmament on a negotiated basis. The non-nuclear weapon, or the nuclear weapon states, they did not commit to this article, and that's why the non-nuclear weapon states went to forward with this PEN treaty, because there was a legal gap, the promise of nuclear weapon states to commit to Article 6 and not to abide by it. It seems to be a success story. On the other hand, I have to remember that we are witnessing that the arms control boundaries are dismantled, they are abandoned. A case in point, of course, is the demise of the INF Treaty on intermediate range nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear weapons basically can be based on the territories in Asia and Europe as well. Other treaties survived barely. We have the New START Treaty, which should be extended before February 5. probably the Biden administration will extend it. Open is for how long? 1 year, 2 years, 5 years again. So we will have an event in the framework of this series on February 15, but we look at it also in the context of great power competition, which includes the US, Russia, but also China, how China can be included in future arms control negotiations. And again, some would say again, we are planning a debate about the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, which barely survived the Trump administration. However, this time we look at the JCPOA from a different perspective in the context of the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East and in the context of the Abraham Accords between Israel and some Arab states with the inclusion of the United States. That will take place on March 15. Then further on, also we are planning, we don't have a date for it yet, we are planning a debate, also a discussion on how to proceed with North Korea's nuclear program. So we have a full program. We will have several events in between. When I say we, I mean the International Institute for Peace. You see the logo behind me, and the director of the institute now will take over and chair the discussion. Thank you again for participating. I'm looking forward to an exciting debate.
Thank you very much, Heinz, for this introduction. And I also would like to welcome all the participants and especially, of course, also our speakers. And you already mentioned several things I was going to say in the beginning, but I would also like to ask our participants that you are free to ask questions in the Q&A session. And after we have like an initial round of some questions answered by our speakers, we will happily ask you to answer then the questions of the participants. Heinz already mentioned several things I was going to say in the beginning, especially that there is also a lot of boycotting on this on the treaty. So I'm very happy now to already start with Nadia Schmidt. Nadia Schmidt is she's the chair of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons in Austria. And I think it is a huge success story, especially for a civil society organization like ICAN, who was also rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts in supporting the abolishment of nuclear weapons. And you personally and your organization has been dealing there. You followed the process from the beginning, and you also know that it is now quite a surprise that it enters into force already this Friday. So today, this week is a very important week. We have the inauguration of the President Biden in the US, but we also have this treaty which abolishes on an international basis nuclear weapons. So my question to you would be if you could give us just some of your ideas on what is the status, how was the process? I mean, how did this treaty enter into force? What are the biggest challenges? What is at the core of the treaty? I mean, why is it important that we do have this treaty? And what do you think is the most important issues from your point of view, from a civil society? And please, for about 10 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And also thank you for the invitation for organizing this panel today. I will try to be brief and get it in 10 minutes because it's a quite wide and a lot of questions you asked me. But I want to start with one sentence that I always wanted to be able to say that nuclear weapons have always been immoral so to say. But with Friday, they will be finally illegal. Or to be more specific, there will be a treaty which is binding international law that prohibits nuclear weapons. The ban treaty itself will greatly strengthen the global taboo against the use and the possession of nuclear weapons. And another very important aspect of it is that it rejects the notion that nuclear weapons are acceptable for some. It makes one field, all states, a one level playing field. Heinz GÄRTNER already mentioned what is prohibited. So there are extensive activities around nuclear weapons prohibited by those states that ratified it by Friday. I just want to add towards the prohibition of the development, testing, production, acquisition, hosting, also an aspect of positive obligations that were specifically important also to us in the negotiation process and now in the outcome. And these positive obligations I want to look specifically on is victims assistance and environmental remediation. It's very new for the first time, and that states parties to the ban treaty must provide assistance to individuals that have been impacted by nuclear weapons, by the use and by the testing. And it also needs to take the necessary measures towards the environmental remediation. Additionally, there's also the International Cooperation and Assistance article that obliges states to help affected states and the citizens in these two aspects. And this is new, and I think a very, very important part also of this treaty. Where do we stand with today? 51 states have already ratified it, and thanks to the 50th state in October, which was Honduras that ratified it, the automatic entry into force process was triggered. And now 90 days after this ratification, it will enter into force on Friday. But furthermore, we have additional 37 states that have already signed the treaty and will for sure in due course ratify it. And if we look at which states are really strongly supporting the treaty, we can look at the number of 122 states. This is the number of states that voted in favor the ban treaty in the negotiations in New York in July 2017. Just last week, Norwegian's People Aid and ICAN published the ban monitor, looking at different states' policies and looking which states would comply with the ban treaty and which are not. And there we have a number that 42 states engage in conduct that is not compatible with the ban. 9 of them, of course, are nuclear weapon states, and 33, they act in conflict because they are part of nuclear alliances or host nuclear weapons. And maybe of specifically interest for us Austrians, 27 of those countries are in Europe, in the European Union. Maybe I just briefly say something about the special features of the process that we got there to the ban treaty. I think one very important thing to mention about this process is the creation of the movement behind. On the one hand, it's like a very strong civil society movement, bringing in a new energy and bringing in hundreds of different NGOs from all over the world and also young people working together in a kind of multi-stakeholder group with states, one of them, or maybe for me most important, the Austria, playing a role, and working together with international organizations like-minded states and NGOs, and like pushing this process forward. The second very important aspect, in my opinion, is the change in the discourse and the change in the dynamics that happened with it. So the change in discourse is that through putting humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons at the center, of course, we know since Second World War what the consequences are, and that they are indiscriminate and catastrophic. But the very important part of this process that led to the PEN Treaty is that these consequences were put into the center, and that we as ICAN and as NGO and civil society, we pushed the states to draw conclusions and to draw practical conclusions out of this fact of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences. This opens up another part that is very important for this, is who was involved in the process. So there is, especially these days, a lot of criticism that nuclear weapon states did not participate in the negotiations, they retract the treaty, and the same is with their allies in NATO and other states that support nuclear weapons policies. This process was not carried out by them. It was the great majority of the rest. Because when I mentioned the figures, the great majority of states or member states of the United Nations do not have weapons, nuclear weapons, or do not have policies that support nuclear weapons policies. So it is easy for them to join this treaty and to fulfill the obligations. But it's also very important that they now, through this process, they got a stake in the process, because we all know that nuclear weapons, the effects, they do not stop at borders. So the effects will be are globally, be it the testing or the effective use of nuclear weapons. So why shouldn't all these states also have a say? And this is the new thing, or the change in the dynamics, that the kind of silent majority or the non-haves worked on a process and pushed those states that still rely on nuclear weapons. And I think there has been a lot of time for them to disarm. I guess like the world waited quite a long time. I'm sure Thomas and Angela will go into like MPT and the other aspects. But people that have the power or have this nuclear weapon, they are most unlikely that they themselves will give this up. So why not being pushed towards something through the majority of the other states, and that they are reminded by the fact that they are not fulfilling obligations they have in other treaties, which means to disarm their nuclear weapons. I think this was maybe a bit more than 10 minutes, but I will stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia, also for reminding us always when it comes to nuclear weapons about the effects they have on the humanitarian side, humanitarian ecological consequences. But also I really much appreciate, this multi-stakeholder approach, and I think you put it quite nicely also to say that this has been a shift. And thank you very much for your input, and we look forward to what else you're going to say in the discussion afterwards. Our next speaker is Ambassador Thomas HAJNOCZI. He used to be Director for Disarmament, Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in the Austrian Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs. I'm very happy that you're here, Thomas, and I also have prepared a question for you. I mean, already a lot has been mentioned. We talked about boycotting of the whole treaty, of the negotiations by especially the nuclear states, but also by all NATO allies. So my question would be now, considering the whole losing in trust in multilateralism, which we were witnessing those recent years, the question would be now, what political effects does this treaty now have, like also on the states who are having nuclear weapons? And what role might even probably the US also take up now that Biden administration is going to be inaugurated today? So maybe you can try to bridge it a little bit. Also with this argument about the nuclear deterrence argument, which seems to be the strongest one and is quite interesting and striking also, especially for states not having nuclear weapons. So please, the floor is yours, and glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and my greetings to all speakers and participants in this event. Well, when you mentioned now the boycotting, I was thinking when I was standing there in the UN General Assembly Hall at the start of the negotiations in 2017, chatting with Beatrice Fien from ICAN, and she remarked to me, "Isn't it a strange world? The ambassadors of the nuclear weapon states are standing outside protesting against the start of the negotiations, and I, as a member of civil society, I'm inside and can take part in the negotiations." And I think that underlines how, let's say, unusually the nuclear weapon states reacted throughout the process, because the process started with these conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And we had scientists, leading experts presenting the various issues, even things like cyber hacking, nuclear winter, and also the risks that are intolerable of nuclear weapons. And the nuclear weapon states didn't really want to involve. And finally, in the last conference in Vienna, after a lot of prodding, we got the US and the Brits to come. But well, they didn't take part in these open-ended working groups that were necessary in order to build up the process. And of course, they were not there in 2017, and on that occasion, also the umbrella states, as we call them, those states that seek the umbrella of nuclear weapons for their security policy, did not take part, with the exception of the Netherlands. That was also a little bit unusual because it was an open UN process. I myself presented the resolution in the General Assembly that led to the negotiations. We got a huge majority, and all states were invited. And well, of course, if they chose to come, we cannot do anything about it. But so there was no exclusion or whatsoever. And then, of course, afterwards, when you have been invited to a party, you didn't go there to complain. Yeah, you can do so, but it lacks a lot of credibility. And what is also remarkable is that the idea of a prohibition norm is not contentious. The US is always giving these statements that in order to reach a world without nuclear weapons, you will need a prohibition norm. But the problem for them was that this prohibition norm was now really negotiated and came about because in their thinking it should come at the very end when there are very few, perhaps a handful of nuclear weapons. So this again is in clear contrast to our experience with all other weapons that were banned, especially the other weapons of mass destruction. Think of chemical weapons, biological weapons, and I think it's rational that you first need the prohibition norm, and then the destruction, of course, will hopefully start. So the treaty, as Nadia has already exposed, was a challenge to the nuclear weapon states insofar as that they lost the monopoly on nuclear weapon negotiations, that something could be done that they don't like, and then they knew they are in a minority that didn't show up. The norm itself, of course, is quite strong, and they themselves testify to the impact because there's a certain campaign against the treaty, which is also interesting because on one hand they say it's inefficient because we are not there, and on the other hand they say it's efficient because it's quite dangerous and therefore please don't go and sign. And they clearly have a problem with it. Why, you said yourself, the whole concept of nuclear deterrence is challenged. Once a weapon is prohibited, of course you're not supposed to have it and to use it anymore. And the idea that nuclear weapons could provide security is a remnant of the Cold War in a bipolar world. And now nobody can really tell whether it worked or not because we think there was no nuclear confrontation. But in today's world, it cannot work. I mean, most scientists also say, multipolar world, you have cyber hacking, so nuclear weapons are unreliable, with hypersonic weapons that are 20 times faster than sound. So what is the value of having this mutually assured destruction? The first strike could do it. So there are a number of reasons. And what is quite sad is that a real discussion cannot start because the nuclear weapons, they just don't want to have a discussion on this. And the effect you see precisely now, we have the entry into force at the time of the pandemic, and the trillions of dollars that are siphoned off that would be used for health issues, development issues, climate change issues, they are consumed by building weapons that basically don't serve any service. And another indication is that after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they were not used anymore. And there's a former Indian chief of staff told in a conference where I was also a speaker, we as military people, we cannot use these weapons. They're just for politicians. There's no military value. I mean, it's rather suicidal. The moment you use them, your opponent, who has also nuclear weapons, would hit you. So the population of a country with nuclear weapons is hit twice. They might be extinguished very rapidly by the counter-strike. And in addition, those who are not affected by this so much, they will suffer from the global effects that nuclear weapons have. And I think NADJA also pointed to this. And that has also changed the perspective. It's not a matter of nuclear weapon states. It's a matter of all of us and also of all citizens. And therefore, I think it was very important that throughout the process, civil society, scientists, international organizations like the ICRC and so on, played an active role. And I think by that also this treaty has set a new standard. So I think with this, I have used my 10 minutes and I'm happy to come back later.
Thank you very much, Thomas. I think it is also quite in line on also what NADJA said, like this multi-stakeholder process has been very, very interesting, but also this paradox between not having nuclear weapons through having nuclear weapons, or at least not make them usable. I would now like to go to Angela KANE, and Angela KANE used to be High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. She's also the Vice President at the IIP, and I'm pretty sure, your knowledge in this field is quite huge. And my question would be to you, because it was already mentioned also the NPT treaty and how this conference now had to be postponed because of COVID. And we're all now in this strange situation with the pandemic, and we see that security has to be seen differently. With the pandemic, with environment, like all of these security issues, they cannot be fought with weapons. So Angela, my question to you would be, like, what role did the United Nations have, and how do you see like all these security concerns and also this human security concept when it comes to nuclear weapons, and also in the context of the ban treaty? And of course, please also feel free to add to what Thomas or Nadia have already been saying. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So as Stephanie said, I'm always delighted when we're talking about a subject that is kind of right up my alley, so to say. So thank you also to Nadia and Thomas for your comments, and I look forward to Tom's comments as well when it comes to that. I just wanted to go back a little bit because what we're really dealing with here is a total game changer. It's a total game changer. And I think it's very, very hard to even realize right now how much of a game changer that is. And I find it very interesting because when you look at the statements that have been made by the nuclear weapon states and their allies, they have been so insulting and so condescending that I have never heard anything before like that in diplomacy. And I've been around diplomacy for a long time. But if you think about it, they sort of said initially, we never will become a member of it, we will never sign, never ratify, become party. And then the most capping incident was really, I think it was in November, when the United States sent a letter to the signatories and ratifiers of the TPNW, basically asking them, yes, you're a sovereign country, yes, you can do what you want, but we urge you to unsign the treaty. And that was really something that I have never seen before in diplomacy. I found it absolutely amazing that countries are being signed to unsign or unratify a treaty. And that prompted one of the ambassadors to basically come out and say, and this is a matter of record, to say, well, if it comes to that, then why not unsign the NPT, for example? If that's so easy as that, then why not unsign the NPT? So you can see we're going down very, very dangerous territory in that sense. But what has really been underestimated, in my opinion, and I find that very interesting, you have a movement in the United Nations and in the world that's called the non-aligned movement. And those of you who are very familiar with political science will know that it was founded already in 1955 in Bandung in Indonesia. Now, 1955 basically meant that you had 76 members of the United Nations. It was still a very small number. Now, the non-aligned movement has 120 members and is a very powerful player. And to my mind, what you have created, or what has been created with the TPNW, is a community of like-minded people. Beforehand, yes, you had like-minded states, but it is much stronger because it now is a community. That, to my mind, is absolutely very, very meaningful because it gives a lever that just hasn't been done before. People were acting more individually rather than an alliance. And now you have an alliance of member states who have signed or ratified the TPNW, and NADJA has already given us the numbers. It's 86 or 87 right now. Very, very important number. And you asked also what has happened in terms of with regard to the member states who have nuclear weapons, or those who are under the nuclear umbrella and who've also opposed it. To my mind, what is really important when you look at the NPT, that Article 6 should have really compelled those members, particularly the ones with the nuclear weapons, but also the others, to sort of say we must honor the third pillar of the NPT, and that basically means Article 6. And to look for further reducing or outlawing nuclear weapons, but to not participate in the negotiations and then complain afterwards, as Thomas sort of said, not going to the party and then complaining afterwards like, well, I don't agree with what's happened. That's really something that I find absolutely astounding when it comes to that. But what has happened is that it's really changed the discourse. And what I mean by that is that all of a sudden it was always the criticism came from the part of the non-nuclear weapon states against the nuclear weapon states. And all of a sudden it's turned around, meaning that the nuclear weapon states are now criticizing the non-nuclear weapon states. So that, to my mind, is really important, that this discourse has changed tremendously. And when I look at the NPT, and you asked specifically, Stephanie, about that, the criticisms of the opponents of the TPNW, of course, sort of say it's impossible and counterproductive to separate the issue of nuclear weapons in isolation from the international security environment. That is the argument that they use. And they also fear, and they have voiced that the TPNW would in fact undermine or fuel disagreement among NPT member states because it challenges the parameters of the nuclear weapons discourse that has prevailed for decades. And that's again the change in paradigm, the change in discourse that I find so important. And the other TPNW criticism, the other nuclear weapon states criticism is that the TPNW risks undermining the IAEA safeguards regime. And I'll come to that in a minute, because some of the provisions are not effectively verifiable. And then there's also been criticism about some of the lack of analytical depth, clarity of key concepts. For example, what is the threat of nuclear weapons? What is the scope of assistance? And so they sort of say, well, there's ambiguities in terms of legal concepts, etc. Now, when I look at the other side of the coin, which is actually where my heart is, I will say that very clearly, that both the NPT and the TPNW lack clarity in some of the concepts. It is not only true for the TPNW, it is also true of the NPT, but the underlying principle is that both treaties really argue for the cessation of the nuclear arms race, or in the TPNW case, goes further and says we abolish nuclear arms. And this is why every state party to the NPT and to the TPNW basically committed to the goal of a world without nuclear weapons. And that means that it's not adversarial with the NPT, but rather that they're not in conflict. And when it comes to the IAEA safeguards, when I look at the TPNW provisions, it requires that each non-nuclear weapon state shall, and at a minimum, it says, maintain the safeguards agreement with the IAEA that are in force at the time of ratification. So if you ratify and you have signed the additional protocol, you must maintain that. If you haven't done that, you must maintain the regular protocol. But what the other issue is that it does not require that in the NPT either. And the additional protocol is right now an additional measure, because it's the standard of verification is basically not measured by the additional protocol. It's enforced by, I think, about 136 countries right now in the NPT, but it is not mandatory. And neither has the NPT ever made it mandatory. So that's really very important. Now, when we talk about the NPT and what is happening, now the NPT, which has now been postponed till August 2021, and if you will recall, it was originally scheduled to be held now, I think starting tomorrow or whatever. And that would have been very interesting to see if the TPNW would have come into force, entered into force at the time of the NPT holding. But my question is really like, will the P5 then desist from this very strong criticism that they have set so far? And can they come down from what I would call the high horse of condescension to the non-nuclear weapon states who are in favor of the treaty? And then could they really sort of say that the NPT is the primary venue to tackle nuclear weapons reductions? And how would that actually happen? There's never been a proposal how it is made. Nothing, in fact, has happened about bringing down the numbers or anything else that has brought forward the goal of Article 6. And that would, to my mind, ensure, if there were proposals coming from the nuclear weapon states, that the NPT keeps its legitimacy. But right now, it's very much in question as to what will happen. And the other question that I have to the nuclear weapon states is, could they accept the TPNW as a complement to disarmament obligations? And could they focus on measures to strengthen nuclear risk reduction efforts, like we've been talked already about the humanitarian consequences? Where is the risk reduction measures? We don't know that. And the NPT is also about the risk reducing the risk of accidental nuclear weapons use. And I think it was in the final document of 2010, which referenced, of course, the humanitarian consequences, which started all of this, as has already been outlined. I think there are additional measures that can be envisioned, bringing the CTB into force. I mean, there are a lot of measures that could be taken. All eyes are now on what is happening with President Biden coming into office. Will he actually change the parameters? Will he make it easier for the US and possibly influencing other states to have a different way forward? But on the other hand, the principles of the norms that NADJA SCHMIDT already talked about is a very, very important one. It has helped. Even though it's not recognized by the nuclear weapon states, they say, no, it is not a norm. It will not advance the norm. In my opinion, That is incorrect. It has already done it has added tremendous value in establishing the norm. And we wouldn't have it, and let me say that also, we wouldn't have it without the advocacy of civil society. That's been extremely, extremely helpful. That's been extremely powerful. And I take my hat off to also the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, which awarded ICAN the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, which really gave it great recognition of those efforts in particular. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Angela, for this very elaborated opinion. And I think it's also very interesting that you said like this change of discourse, which really makes a difference, which really makes the TPNW different from like other armed controls treaties. Now let's go to our last, but definitely not least speaker, to Professor Tom SAUER from the University of Antwerp in Belgium. He's at the Department of Political Science. And I see there are already questions coming in. So also please, all participants, if you have questions, feel free to ask those. Because actually the first one is quite the similar question that I was going to ask you anyway. And it deals with how we talked about boycotting of the treaty, that NATO member states are not willing to join it and do not intend to join it. So the question is, what could be done to convince, especially those, not only the P5, but also like their allies, in that, how to convince them that the world without nuclear weapons would be safer? I mean, what is your stance on this? And please, of course, also feel free to react on what Angela or Thomas or Nadia already have been saying. The floor is yours. You're welcome.
Thanks, Stephanie. I basically agree with what the previous speakers have already said, and especially Angela, what she said about the treaty. That's a complete game changer. Now, I'm not sure that they will agree with me. Now, the entry into force of the treaty yields strong and mixed emotions. Advocates expect an acceleration of the climb to the summit of Mountain Global Zero. Opponents repeat that the nuclear-armed states will never sign the treaty. Now, if the nuclear-armed states are not willing to ban nuclear weapons, though, the odds are that others will not believe their promises to eliminate nuclear weapons, as required by the NPT. So that does not bode well for the NPT, the so-called cornerstone of the nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. And the TPNW is a manifestation of the frustration on behalf of the non-nuclear weapon states about the very slow reduction rate of nuclear disarmament by the nuclear weapon states and their allies under the NPT, especially over the last 2 decades. And if the signal of this treaty is not picked up by the nuclear weapon states and their allies, these frustrations will come back like a boomerang. This time, these frustrations will not be canalized by another treaty. Done that, been there. A possible next step is to withdraw from the NPT. North Korea did already so. Iran has threatened to do so. And if that threat is carried out by Iran, the odds are that Saudi Arabia and possibly Turkey and Egypt will follow. At the UN General Assembly in September 2019, the Turkish President Erdogan made clear that he did not like that discriminatory nature of the NPT, and for which he got a lot of applause. Egypt has already walked out of one of the NPT prepcoms. And also other non-nuclear weapon states ask themselves why they have to fulfill their NPT obligations, while the nuclear weapon states do not, at least in their perception. So threatening to leave the NPT is the leverage the non-nuclear weapon states have. If they really believe that the nuclear armed states and their allies are not willing to give up their nuclear weapons, they have not much to lose by withdrawing from the NPT. The discriminatory NPT regime would be left behind, and I can start building a more equal regime from scratch. Is that desirable? Probably not. It may lead to more proliferation. Luckily, this scenario can still be prevented. The ball is now in the camp of the 9 nuclear-armed states and their allies. Do they remain dismissive of the TPNW, and do they continue modernizing their nuclear arsenals for the coming 80 years for trillions of dollars, or do they understand the signal? And it's in the first place up to the allies to take a decision. Do they keep hiding behind the nuclear armed states, or do they start acting as non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT? Worse, the Allies do not only hide behind the nuclear-armed states, they help the nuclear-armed states hiding behind them. And they're probably not even aware of that. The United States, United Kingdom, and France continue to legitimize the nuclear weapons arsenals and doctrines, not only by pointing to the outside threats, but also to the demands of the Allies. And that mechanisms already existed before the invasion of the Crimea. 2 examples. Without the European allies, the US advocates of the expensive modernization program of the B-61 bomb, it costs more than $10 billion for 400 bombs, may not have won the debate inside the United States. Without Japan, another example, without Japan and European allies, the Obama administration in all likelihood would already have announced a no first use or a sole purpose doctrine. The allies are at least as much responsible for the current status quo with respect to NATO's nuclear weapons policy than the 3 nuclear armed states. The next question is, can the allies decollectivize NATO's nuclear weapons policy? Can the allies distance themselves from the current policy? And it seems that the allies fundamentally believe that that's not possible. Personally, I do not agree. First of all, nuclear weapons are not mentioned in the Treaty of Washington that established the alliance in 1949. Nuclear weapons were neither mentioned in the first 2 strategic concepts, which were classified documents at that time. The reason was that the Danish Prime Minister at that time did not like the nuclear weapons to be part of NATO's strategy, and he vetoed that. Now, that all changed in the 1950s, and in 1957, the proposal to install tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe was agreed upon. But again, that was a political decision, and political decisions can be changed at any time, especially if the external circumstances change. Second, some NATO member states have a so-called footnote policy stating that they would never station nuclear weapons on their territory. Not in peacetime, that applies to Spain, Norway, Denmark, and not even in wartime for Iceland and Lithuania. So there's no reason why the current host nations of tactical nuclear weapons cannot follow in their footsteps and go one step further and distance themselves from NATO's nuclear weapons policy in general. Third, add this new treaty. The percentages of the people in Western Europe in favor of signing the TPNW are very high. In my country, 77%. Only 10% is against. And still our governments continue to follow the line of the nuclear weapon states. That's structurally undemocratic. And in my view, but I may be wrong, that position of our governments is not tenable in term. It's not sustainable. The pressure to change the policy will increase. And the good news is that there are already cracks in the NATO wall, as we made clear in our War on the Rocks piece in December. To start with the humanitarian initiative, some NATO member states abstained on resolutions in the UN General Assembly in the period 2012-2015. Norway, also a NATO member state, organized the first humanitarian conference in 2013. The Netherlands, as the only NATO member state, abstained on the most important resolution in October 2016, announcing the start of these multilateral negotiations, despite enormous pressure from the United States not to do so. The Netherlands was even present at those negotiations, as, again, only NATO member states. And you know why? Because the democratic system worked. Yeah? NGOs like PAX and TPNW raised 40,000 signatures on the streets, which in the Netherlands automatically yields a parliamentary debate, where the Minister of Foreign Affairs was present, and the majority and opposition parties together agreed to require that the government would at least be present at the negotiations. And a similar example in my own country, Belgium. The current government declaration that goes back to last September contains a sentence that refers positively to the TPNW, something that none of the NATO allies ever had done. It does not say that Belgium is going to sign, but Labour and the Greens worked tirelessly to get the sentence approved. It was watered down, but the end result was not liked in the other NATO member states, let alone in the nuclear armed states. Again, thanks to the lobbying of NGOs and academics. I know from the inside that nuclear weapons was the last issue that stood between brackets with respect to foreign and defense policy, and that party leaders discussed this issue for more than 1 hour. These 2 examples in the Netherlands and Belgium give a boost to many NGOs in other NATO member states. And there are now national elections coming up in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Norway, in Portugal. And of course, they want to do better than us, especially the Dutch. So we should try to introduce some kind of competition amongst ourselves. And in December, also the Spanish Parliament approved a positive reference to the TPNW. And so the snowball is rolling, and it won't be stopped. And the good news is that many of our opponents are still sleeping. And when they wake up, like in the mid-December, they hastily come together inside NATO to agree on a Cold War statement. So NATO is becoming nervous. And I think that's not bad. Does this mean that the end is in sight? No. To give the example of my own country, the Labour and Green parties lost the internal debate inside the government over a vote in the UN General Assembly last December. But of course, they do not want to lose each time from now onwards on this issue. So I'm hopeful that more steps in the right direction will be taken. So what kind of steps I'm thinking about, and I will end with these three. One is a general change in attitude of our allied governments vis-à-vis nuclear weapons. Now, nuclear deterrence dominates, and nuclear disarmament was sitting in the margins. That should be reversed. Our government could, for instance, repeat what the Norwegian government in 2010 already stated at the review conference, that nuclear weapons are the most inhumane weapons ever invented. Our country, and maybe with the support of others, could circulate a non-paper inside NATO in this regard, also in preparation for the next NATO strategic concept. Second, also the attitude or tone vis-à-vis the TPNW, the ban treaty, should change from being dismissive to a more neutral or preferably a positive tone. And very concretely, it would be desirable if many of the non-nuclear weapon states inside NATO would be present at the first meeting of the TPNW state parties within 1 year, at least as an observer. Maybe also a group of friends of the ban treaty could be established inside NATO. And at the UN General Assembly, some of the allies could vote in favor or at least abstain on the TPNW resolution next autumn. Third and lastly, one should start serious thinking on how to withdraw the tactical nuclear weapons from Western Europe. And these weapons are being modernized and thus replaced next year. This is an ideal moment to keep them in the United States and not bring them back. Maybe the follow-up bilateral arms control negotiations of New START between the United States and Russia will include tactical nuclear weapons. Our states should let DC, Washington DC, know that we are in favor of withdrawal. That means that we will have to reassure the East Europeans with other means, with conventional deterrence, which is more credible, and that we probably have to withdraw the missile defense systems in Eastern Europe as well. So in short, with the entry into force of the TPNW, the international community stands at a crossroad with respect to the future of nuclear weapons. The non-allied non-nuclear weapon states have done their part. It's now up to the allies to put pressure on the nuclear armed states, and not only the United States, UK and France, all the others as well. Otherwise, a world without nuclear weapons will indeed become a utopian goal, and nuclear weapons will further spread. Under that scenario, the only hope that remains is that nuclear weapons will never be used, just like we hoped that a global pandemic would never arise.
Thank you very, very much, Tom, for this interesting line of thoughts also. And I think it is very important also that you mentioned the responsibility of the allies as well, not only talking about the nuclear weapon states themselves, but also the responsibility their allies are having, and this trying to change attitudes like from all states involved. And before we go into the questions, I would very quickly like to ask the panelists if you would like to add on something since what has been saying since Nadia spoke first and then Angela and then Thomas. So if you want to add something on the other panelists, please raise your hand. Otherwise, I will go into the discussion already. Yes, Angela, please go on.
I had already commented on Nadia and Thomas's presentation, so I don't want to do that, but I found it very interesting what Tom said, and I just want to underline that. And I think that the power of the vote, particularly among the younger generation, is extremely, extremely powerful. And I think that when you look at some of the polls that have been taken recently, it's like 87% of all of the millennials in Europe. They included actually also the US in this poll. They included the US and also South Korea and Japan. But on the other, 87% were against nuclear weapons and said they felt threatened by nuclear weapons and they were expecting that nuclear weapons would not be used. Very powerful statement. But against that, I should also like to mention that, for example, in a previous government in Germany, there was actually, they always, if there's a coalition government, they always make a treaty as to what it is that they agree on, just like in other countries. And in that, it was under Westerwelle, who was at that time foreign minister, there was a commitment that nuclear weapons would actually be withdrawn from Germany, and that was never implemented. But now what comes, and this is another important aspect, is the cost of it all. It's exactly what Tom said about replacing some of the bombers that would deliver actually nuclear weapons. And that is extremely, extremely expensive. But I find that when you look at the media, it is not very much highlighted, and it should be. And this is something that I find very, very important, that it should be highlighted. But with regard to NATO, I find it absolutely incredible when you think about that. You know, in November 2020, they sort of said it remains a nuclear alliance. In December, 1 month later, they said we collectively, including the allies, we collectively reiterate our opposition to this treaty. So something has to change there, and it's not going to change on its own, but it will change when you have parliamentary pressure. And that, to my mind, is extremely important. And wasn't there a vote, Tom, in Belgium just a day or two ago about a resolution with the TPNW? I mean, it was a very short margin, like 8 votes, 66 to 74. I looked at that the other day. Yeah, could you just answer that?
Yeah, that was in the beginning of 2020 in the parliament.
I thought it was recently. I must have misread the number there.
It was just 1 year ago. Yeah.
But it was a really important vote. It was an important
vote, but it was not so close as the media said. So let's be realistic.
I'm glad you clarified that. Thank you very much. But again, you know, it's the younger people who really have a lot of input in that, and that coupled with the environmental issues is very, very important, because we all know the environmental damage that is being caused by nuclear weapons, whether it's dismantling, you know, whatever. So yeah, thanks. And nuclear waste is another issue. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Angela. I think Thomas also wanted to say something, and Nadia as well. Thomas, you can start.
Yeah, thank you. And I also can answer 2 questions already that I see here on my screen. Very good questions. The first one was, what would Germany have to do to join the TPNW? Obviously, I mean, the stationing of nuclear weapons in Germany would have to cease. And as you know, it's not just the stationing. German military pilots are trained to fly nuclear weapons. These things would have to change. And then Germany legally wouldn't have any impediment to become a state party, but in their policy, also within NATO, they would not take part in activities that assist nuclear weapons. And that is fully possible. France has done so for decades. In NATO, yes, they were a member, but they didn't take part in the nuclear planning group. So it wouldn't be a novelty or whatsoever. So these things could be done once there's a political majority in Germany to join. NATO, I think, is used a lot by those who really want to oppose the TPNW. That doesn't mean that nationally all NATO members are fervently against the treaty. And that's documented. I remember in 2017, in autumn, most NATO countries had in their general debate statements, and especially nuclear debate statements in the first committee, some lines against the treaty. When we had the last full debate in 2019, it was only 4 NATO countries, obviously the 3 nuclear weapon states and another one. So there's less, what should I say, fervent vigor against the TPNW on national level. And that's a good development. And I would also expect that the Biden administration will tune down, of course, a little bit the language and the activities. What is even more interesting is that a high number of former foreign ministers, defense ministers, prime ministers, even 2 former NATO secretary generals has signed this open letter that was published by ICAN, which calls for their countries to become state parties to the TPNW. So, I mean, these were the politicians at the helm of NATO. So I think there is a certain tendency, at least once you are not anymore in a certain job, you can speak your mind and become more positive to the TPNW. So I think there will be developments also due to the domestic political situation in some of the NATO countries, where one day perhaps the first NATO country would make a move. It won't be immediately to join the treaty, but slowly. And I think there are quite a number of other countries then sitting on the fence who might go there. It's just, it's the shell game also, who dares first. My friend Ellen Ware put forward two questions. One is concerning disinvesting. Well, in the treaty, there's no obligation to disinvest. I think it was in the negotiations a matter that was discussed, but it was found that it would be very difficult to implement it. I mean, just think of all these mixed funds, and one of these funds might have a company in it like Boeing or whatever, and then how do you want to implement such a norm? And the implementation, the national implementation of the TPNW is very important. I mean, for example, you need in the penal law something that prohibits to assist nuclear weapons and so on and so on. And we didn't want to include things that cannot be really implemented. And the same holds true for the second question from Ellen, what about transit? Yeah, nobody of us wants to see nuclear weapons transiting through the country, through the territorial waters. But how on earth could a small island developing country really implement that no subs with nuclear weapons are transiting through its territorial waters? You couldn't really implement this. So that's the reason why these two things are not in the treaty. And in reality, we see already a lot of this investment. The largest public funds disinvest in the nuclear weapon companies because the TPNW helped also to raise this issue. And there's a majority in many countries that do not want to put their money, like the Norwegian pension fund, into promoting nuclear weapon industry. So things are working even without having been included in the treaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Nadia, you also wanted to add something, but maybe you can also touch upon the question which I'm reading there, which asks, given the additional protocols under the TPNW will be mandatory for nuclear weapon states, but not for non-nuclear weapon states. Do you view this as an insurmountable barrier to nuclear weapon states joining the treaty? And if yes, how might this disparity be overcome? Maybe you can touch upon this as well, but please also feel free to whatever you wanted to say earlier on. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Maybe Thomas was giving a lot of the points, because I also wanted to point out the letter of the 46 former NATO leaders that was published last year, which shows, in my opinion, very clearly that it's a political question. So if one's out of power, you still realize that it is possible for NATO countries and that it's necessary for NATO countries maybe to join the ban treaty. Also, additional to Angela, with the extensive polling that we have done in nuclear hosting states, I think just overall, we have in all the countries more than 70 up to 80% of the people wanting their countries to join the Treaty on the Prohibition, and also like a huge majority in the nuclear weapon hosting states, especially in Europe, to withdraw the weapons. And just to hint a bit is like to the, how do I say, the, not the energy, but the drive of the campaign. Because when we started at 2007, the first years were maybe a bit slow, but what happened in the last years was a very fast development. On the one hand, about the knowledge of this, but also how broadly human security is discussed among people, but also the possibilities that NATO states and other countries have, especially what civil society or the people have in influences, like the campaigning success of getting the Netherlands to the negotiations. And I just read yesterday that the ICAN campaigners in the United States have the first Democrat representative supporting the parliamentary pledge. And the parliamentary pledge is in a lot of countries kind of like for us in campaigning one of the first steps in getting support. Like we had in Austria also first a couple of parliamentarians and ended up with all Austrian parliamentarians issuing a resolution. One new aspect I would like to bring into the debate is the question of human security and nuclear weapon spending in times of COVID and the environmental crisis we have. It's also mentioned in one of the questions. If we look at the figures that ICAN has published last year, $72.9 billion were spent on nuclear weapons and the modernization in 2019 by the nuclear weapons possessor states. I mean, we can now look at like if modernization is against Article 6 in NPT, and in my opinion, it's like modernization in general should not take place. But if we look at the figures, it's massive, because we also calculated what does it mean per minute what is spent. And it's like $100,038,699 spent per minute. In times of a global crisis where more and more people realize that security is not really a question of military and a question of weapon system, but it's like the human in the center, and the question, how can people and how securely can people live in a territory? And I think COVID and the climate crisis we have clearly show a direction where our common campaigning, but also the view of the people will go like even stronger in the future, because how can one really tell its people that there is not enough of money for a health system to care about the people, but there is a lot of money for modernizing nuclear weapons that we are not going to use because we are in favor of a world free of nuclear weapons, but we need to invest because we need to have the deterrence. And I think that it's like more and more getting into the public, also like as we more and more succeed in getting through to media and university and getting into this topic. And the pace within the last 2 years or 3 years since the treaty was negotiated and we received the Nobel Peace Prize is very fast. And I guess we're in the middle of it, like really being able to change it, like from what's on.
Thank you very much, Nadia. There is an additional question. I don't know who wants to answer, maybe Angela or Tom, which deals also with the United States and the hopes we are now putting into the Biden administration. Tarek Rauf, former head of verification and security policy at the IAEA, says that it was already in October 2016 under Obama that US sent a letter to NATO states to boycott TPNW. So the question is, how can TPNW states send a clear message to Washington to soften its opposition and engage to develop common ground for the NPT review conference? Who would like to answer that. Yeah, Angela, please.
I can answer that, though I'm not sure that it's a satisfactory answer. I believe that what is happening in the United States, Biden has already set out a program of the priorities that he has for the first 100 days, maybe beyond. And in any case, they're very extensive and they're very far-reaching, and they're very revolutionary when you look at what he's trying to undo of all the damage that has been done in the past 4 years. However, I must tell you that the TPNW is not among that. And not even the New START is among that. So that, to my mind, was rather disappointing when I looked at that. There is a lot that is basically focusing also on the internal management of the United States, of healing rifts with allies, etc. So my sense is that the TPNW is not going to be on the top of his agenda, in any case, for the first couple of months. And as you know, foreign policy has never been on the top of the agenda domestically in the United States. And it's never been it's never been a big feature when it comes to election campaigns or whatever. Very rarely has it even been mentioned in that. What I do find even more important than at this point at the TPNW is that something happens on the New START, which expires on February 5, unless there is a movement to renew it. And the Russians have indicated that they would like to renew it. However, we'll have to see as to whether that moves or not, as it is not listed there. But when it comes to other countries, and I just do want to make that point, because there was also, if I remember, if it's in the chapter and the Q&As about Japan, and that is another very interesting case in terms of coming back to the role of the allies. And when I was High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, you always said, not only, I went to Hiroshima, I went to Nagasaki for the commemoration, and once you've done that, and once you've visited the museum, once you've visited the memorial sites, once you've visited with the hibakshas, you will not forget that. It will stay with you. It will leave a lasting impression. Then you would have delegations coming to the United Nations and handing over to me, in lieu of the Secretary General, signature papers of like 1 million signatures that they had collected within Japan. Japan's opposition to nuclear weapons and favoring TPNW is about 75%. It's very, very high. But nothing is happening on that because the government basically just rejects it. And there was one of the political parties, which actually, I think it was in November or so, October, they asked the government to basically they want the government to reassess the position to the treaty. And the government basically sort of said, we're waiting for more details, and when these become available, then we'll let you know, which means it's being put alongside and it's not being addressed and will not be addressed for quite some time. So public opinion in that sense has not had the effect in changing the government's position. And again, if you think about what happened with the hibakshas, how that whole issue was suppressed. It took them a long time before they were recognized as hibaksha. It took them a long time before they even got medical help or whatever. So there's a lot of memories of injustice that happened at the time. And I think that the other aspect that is playing into the waiting game, if I can call it that, is also the situation on the Korean Peninsula. With DPRK now again starting to increase nuclear armaments. There was just a meeting that was held, a very large meeting, and where Kim Jong-un basically sort of said, yes, we're going to strengthen our nuclear weapons. Yes, we're going to have more nuclear weapons, etc. So that's another aspect which, when you look at the Japanese political situation, is very much a concern that they do not wish to go the, quote, non-nuclear way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angela. That is also quite in line with what Tom has been saying about this public opinion. But please go along, Tom. You wanted to add something.
Yeah, on public opinion, all these numbers we know, 78% are against. But the problem is that most people do not care about nuclear weapons. That's the problem, and they do not speak out. The politicians do not feel the heat. So, and youngsters also, they don't know nothing anymore about nuclear weapons. And this is a problem of education. We will start up a project, an educative project in Belgium with Rotary to educate youngsters in secondary schools about nuclear weapons, about the threat of nuclear weapons. I think this should be become globalized. They worry about climate change, but they do not know anything about nuclear weapons anymore. And here's also, of course, a normal responsibility for the mainstream media. There's nothing said about of course, if nuclear weapons are in the media, it's about Iran or it's about North Korea, but not about our nuclear weapons, and not about NATO, not about nuclear weapons stationed in Belgium. It's very silent. And one more point about these former ministers. I mean, that says something about the shallowness of the argument of nuclear deterrence. These politicians, these generals, these diplomats, they're all in favor of nuclear weapons until the moment they retire. And then they switch 180 degrees. Strange, no? Because then they start thinking about their grandchildren and they can speak up their mind. Now, that says something about the shallowness of the argument of deterrence and security. So we can easily win that debate. So the problem in NATO is not about deterrence and about security. It's about solidarity, apparently, that the 3 nuclear-armed states expect a kind of solidarity by the allies, also for nuclear weapons. And it will be hard to change that. NATO is kind of addicted to nuclear weapons. 70 years we have used this concept of nuclear deterrence. As Falk and Lifton have written, it's about kind of addiction to nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. There is no more question. There is no more question I'm seeing here. So if anyone wants to have like maybe one last sentence. Yes, please, Thomas, go along.
Yeah, sorry, but indeed, there is a question that hasn't been answered, and that's the question concerning the EU and the TPNW. And I thought I should try to give an answer to this. The TPNW in itself didn't bring anything new within the EU. Since Austria and Ireland has joined the EU, you had the situation that until the 1st of January 2, now one EU member state is a nuclear weapon state. Austria, Ireland, Malta, these 3 are already states parties of the TPNW, by the way, and Cyprus. They have a truly non-nuclear weapon state policy when it comes to nuclear weapons, and they are in opposition to some of the wishes of the nuclear weapon states. And in between, you have the NATO members and the umbrella states. And frankly speaking, sometimes it's extremely difficult to elaborate an EU statement. Of course, the content is sometimes very shallow. And I have been in situations when the most umbrella states told us, well, hammer it out with the French and Brits and then tell us the result. It will definitely be good for us. So this has not changed really through the TPNW, but it's now more obvious again because with the TPNW, we have very different views within the EU. And for that reason, the EU doesn't have any particular credibility to speak on nuclear weapon issues, because whatever we say is good, it's a common denominator, but it doesn't move the balance on nuclear weapons. And also what Angela said with Japan, it's very true. I think like for any other umbrella state, the main problem is that the TPNW revealed the double standard and self-contradiction of the umbrella states, because on one hand, they want to be in favor of a world free from nuclear weapons. They want to take nuclear disarmament initiatives, but they still want at the same time, as they see it, protection by nuclear weapons. So they want that nuclear weapons continue to stay with us. And that there's really a contradiction there. And usually people find it rather painful when their self-contradictions are revealed. So I have a certain understanding for this. And then they try to come with some kind of initiatives that doesn't really move the whole nuclear disarmament movement forward. So this hopefully can be changed a little bit with the help of civil society. And as was said before, I think a good test would be which countries participate as the first meeting of states, but as observers. You don't have to sign anything. If you want, you can speak. If you don't want to speak, you just sit there. But I think it would be good if many many umbrella states would come, because it would also help a little bit to heal this cliff in the community, which, of course, not those countries that were in favor of the TPNW have caused, but those who started this boycotting, preaching against the treaty, and so on. And I think we can talk very nicely together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And my apologies for not seeing the European Union question. It was in a chat function. I was not taking care of that. So thank you very much. Angela, please.
I don't want to answer a question, but I wanted to put a highlight on two of the things that were mentioned. And one of the advantages of being older is, of course, that you remember history. But I appreciate Tom bringing up also the fact about some of the hypocrisy about the minute that politicians, leave their functions, then all of a sudden they turn 180 degrees, and then all of a sudden it comes a totally different view. And I remember those of you, I'm sure very few of them, who have been around during the Vietnam War. Robert McNamara, the U.S. Defense Secretary, was just a total hawk. I'm going to win this. It was going to be McNamara's war, and I'm going to fight it until I win it. And the minute he left office, he turned 180 degrees, and then even gave interviews like into the 2000s. I think he died about 10 years ago, sort of saying how much he regretted all of this, and how sad it all was, how it went, etc. I find that unbelievable. There has to be more honesty, really, by people who are having these functions, but that's another issue. Two aspects that I wanted to mention, and one of them we haven't really explored very much, but Nadia brought it up in the beginning, and that's the victims' assistance. And I find this is very meaningful because there is so much hurt. There's a feeling that there's an injustice that was happening to the peoples, to the populations where nuclear weapons were tested. China only tested in China. It was the UK, it was France. US tested primarily in the US, but also in other countries. And of course, in the Soviet Union, then what is now Kazakhstan, has huge areas. Semipalatinsk, which is degraded environmentally, not only that people have genetic diseases, but also that the countries, that the land is no longer there. And that is a territory that is as large as France, if you will believe that. So there is a lot that I think needs to be addressed. Some of it has happened, but very timidly, and not with a sense of we need to do something, but rather because pressure was brought. And I know that there was recently an event that I took place in, organized by a European parliamentarian from France, who was putting a spotlight on this. Now, obviously, the countries that are right now states parties to the TPNW, on whom this would be incumbent to fix, didn't have nuclear weapons. So it's not, they cannot really do it. But again, it's a way of also putting a spotlight on it and saying this is something that really needs to be addressed, if not this year, but let's not forget about the injustices that were done. And the other aspect is the education one that Tom also mentioned. And when I was in my very first job in the World Bank at the time, I was asked to investigate or to make a study about why weren't economics taught in schools. And the surprising answer I came up with, and it will not surprise you, but it did me at the time, is that the instructors, the teachers, whether it's the high school level, there are very few people at the university level that teach it. They just don't know about it. And one shouldn't start at university. It's too late. You have to start already earlier, in the secondary education. And there's not enough knowledge by the teachers to actually want to undertake this. That is something that needs to be helped. And there are a number of courses that are available, and they're also available online. They are free of charge, but people don't do it unless they're actually being asked or forced to address this. And that is something education has been recognized also within the NPT as an important aspect, that work needs to be done, but I don't really see it. I don't really see it. It's something that really we need to all support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would say we're quite good in time, and if nobody wants to add something, I mean, I can see we can go on with this discussion, and I really very much appreciate also what you have been saying about this education thing, that people do not really care so much about the consequences of nuclear weapons, since most of us think we are safe. This is exactly also why we are doing this webinar, of course, also to talk to each other, and it's quite a good sign also for us to see that we had like close to 60 participants, and that on inauguration day on a Wednesday midday. So I think there is some interest, and I think we will be keeping our focus on that. Thank you very much to all of you for your very elaborated opinions, and from the civil society, from the ministries, from the United Nations, professors. So I really very much appreciate like all these manifold ideas and how important it is to cooperate, to see like all the different how do you say, spheres who actually put into this, to making this becoming, at least as Nadia put it, illegal these days, not only moral but also illegal. What will be the end of it? We will have to look at it. We will have to see what is going on with New START, with the GCPOA. It was mentioned. So, but for now, it was a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your contributions, and hope to see you again, and enjoy a nice evening. Goodbye. Thank you.